The purpose of this video is not to prove that Zionism is bad or that Islam is bad, but only to provide a needed third point of balance in a world torn apart by polarization and division. Zionism is a political philosophy associated with the religion of Judaism, basically with the Jewish people, a national movement that supports the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the ancient land, the Roman territory of Palestine, now called the State of Israel. Islam is one of the three main monotheistic religions emanating from the biblical character known as Abraham thousands of years ago, and is focused mainly on the Prophet Muhammad, who lived about 1400 years ago, and his words were transcribed into a holy book that they call the Quran. Most people in the Muslim world are opposed to Zionism because, well, Zionism is all about the establishment of a Jewish homeland. You know, back before Israel, the modern state of Israel was started, a lot of the Zionist proponents, Theodor Herzl, they were looking at multiple different sites to establish a potential Jewish homeland. One of the main contenders was Argentina. They didn't go with Argentina, they went with Israel, you know, because I guess a lot more stuff in the Bible happened over there than it did in Argentina. The fact that they were choosing between Israel and Argentina shows that they weren't really concerned about who was living on the land already. They just basically wanted to find a suitable piece of land for them to go. So they chose Israel. Now, after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was done for, okay? They were defeated in World War I, and what happened after that was that the British and the French basically carved up the Middle East, okay? Under the Sykes-Picot Agreement, this is where all the modern borders for Middle Eastern countries come from, was the British and the French basically sat down with, you know, rudimentary understanding of the territories involved and just said, all right, we're going to place a border there and a border there, and that'll work out great for everybody, right? The Balfour Declaration was a letter written in 1917 from the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Walter Rothschild, the Baron of the Rothschild family, a high-powered banking dynasty, which most of you on the internet have probably heard of by now, committing the British Empire to the establishment of the Jewish state in Israel. The next main step to the creation of the State of Israel was the Zionist Convention meeting in New York City in 1933, wherein the Confederation of Zionist Jews all over America met together and essentially came to the conclusion that they would declare war on Germany, that they would have a worldwide economic boycott of Germany and deprive it of all economic revenue from the Jewish people. In 1933, Adolf Hitler had just been elected as Chancellor of Germany. The real violent, awful stuff had not started happening yet. But what happened was that the Zionists and the Jews all over the world were boycotting the German state. And after World War I, Germany was already in a very tough position economically with the reparations payments placed upon it by the Treaty of Versailles by the Allied powers, you know, the Western Alliance, who was victorious. So Germany was already in a precarious position. And then all of a sudden there's this worldwide boycott of German goods by Jews all over the world, with a statement emanating from the Zionist Convention in New York City. This added economic pressure from the boycott by the Zionists of the German state essentially caused problems for Hitler, so he sat down at the negotiating table with the Zionist leaders, and they came to an agreement called the Havara Agreement, known essentially as the Transfer Agreement. And when this agreement, Hitler agreed to facilitate the transfer of Jewish people as well as Jewish assets from Germany to Palestine, essentially facilitating the movement of Jews into what would become the State of Israel. Large numbers of Jews from all over the world started moving to Palestine in the hopes of establishing a Jewish state. So both the Arabs and the Jews in British Palestine were rebelling against British control. They both saw the British as colonists and a occupying power that they wanted to get rid of. In 1947, the British referred the question of the Palestine problem to the United Nations. And the United Nations solution was to just split up British Palestine into separate segments, into Arab segments and Jewish segments. The Jewish and Arab segments started to fight each other, without getting into who attacked who first. Battles started erupting, and it started to get a little dicey. May 14, 1948, the people of Israel declared their national independence, and the modern nation-state of Israel was born. 1 year later, 5 Arab Muslim countries surrounding the state of Israel attacked in what is known as the Arab-Israeli War. Even though the Arab states were attacking Israel from all sides, essentially, Israel did have the tactical advantage and was able not only to repel the invading forces, but actually to take a massive amount of land of the former territory of British Palestine for themselves. And the territory of the State of Israel increased massively. Even though the war was over in 1948, the conflicts obviously continued. Conflicts broke out between Israel and Egypt, specifically over the Suez Canal, a very tactically important waterway, even to this day, through which a major amount of the world's oil supplies pass through. In 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan after the leader of Egypt declared his intention to annihilate the Jewish state of Israel. And he allied himself with Syria and Jordan for that purpose. He built up troops on the border and blockaded the Israeli shipping ports. A short war broke out after Israel invaded, a 6-day war during which Israel took even more land for its own control, specifically from Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. To this day, the Israeli military forces occupy these lands. It is highly contested by the Arabs who live in the Middle East, and there are conflicts to this day over the legitimacy of the Jewish state of Israel and right to exist at all. Now, Islam is a monotheistic religion that originated in the 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula, specifically the city of Mecca, which today resides in Saudi Arabia and is the holiest site of Islam. There's a black box in the inside of this major center in Mecca, and it's basically where all the Muslims go as part of their pilgrimage. As one of the 5 pillars of Islam. So there's 5 main pillars of Islam. 5 pillars of Islam. Number 1, having faith in Allah. Number 2, praying 5 times a day in the direction of Mecca. Number 3, giving charity. Number 4, fasting during the month of Ramadan, at least during the sun up to sundown. And 5, the Hajj, the pilgrimage to the sacred site of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Now, before Muhammad, the Arabian Peninsula was, it was still a hard-knock place to live, very violent, patriarchal, tribal, just styles of living. It was sort of a pagan religion, if you will. They worshipped the moon god, Nanar Sin. And Muhammad came in and essentially transformed the existing pagan spirituality into a new form of monotheistic religion. Now, Muhammad had his words transcribed, which became the Quran, their sacred book, and the Gospel of Muhammad moved very quickly throughout the Arab world, and it took root astonishingly quickly, especially as the collapse of the Roman Empire accelerated. Muslims basically taking over all the old territory of the Roman Empire. At its peak, the Islamic Caliphate it spanned basically the entire territory of the ancient Roman Empire, all the way into Spain and Portugal. Eventually, the Islamic territories were so massive that the Christian populations of Europe, well, not the populations, but the nobles and the priests and all them, they decided that they want their Holy Land back, so they organized some crusades, loaded up all their knights on their horses and their big iron suits, and sent them down to kill Muslims and take back the holy city of Jerusalem. Now, the main Islamic government, as we came into the modern era of the 20th century, was the Ottoman Empire, okay? This is basically centered in what is now Turkey. The Ottoman Empire itself occupied the ancient territory of Byzantium, of the Roman Empire. So there was a lot of cultural wealth there, and, a lot of old libraries, old cathedrals, from the classical era. A lot of the books, the ancient libraries were still left there. A lot of cultural wealth that was sitting there in the Arab lands. But, well, due to restrictive nature of the Islamic religion, when the printing press was invented in Europe, the Gutenberg Bible and the printing press allowed this whole transformation of a European society by the dissemination of knowledge. The Ottoman Empire decided to ban the printing press and restrict the publishing of books, It's one of the reasons that the Islamic world is almost a few centuries behind the Western world in terms of the evolution of intellectual and social standards, is because they didn't have all of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment during the 17 and 1800s when Europe was flourishing under the light of that new knowledge. Now, it's important to recognize that despite the institutional and abstractified conflicts, long, well-established conflicts between Jews and Muslims and Christians too, it's important to recognize that in the holy cities of Jerusalem, prior to the 20th century, that people of the different faiths often lived in relative peace and tolerance and coexisted alongside one another without going and cutting each other's heads off all the time. So what changed? Well, what changed was, as usual, the empire got involved. And what do I mean by the empire? Now, about 6 months ago, I made a video called The Empire Dies in 2017. And in that video, I explained the functional definition of the Western Empire. And to recap, it is basically the structure of government beneath the surface governments that we see in our modern Western world. And it is a sub-power structure beneath the governments, essentially, that is all working on the same team. It's comprised of secret societies, lots of different ones. You know, on the internet, a lot of people just call them all the Illuminati. But the truth is, there's lots of different secret societies, lots of different groups, all of which have their own specific interests, but there is a network, there is a structure by which all of those societies communicate with one another and come to mutual agreements. The first imperial city that was founded, at least within the last 3,000 years, was Rome. Okay, all roads lead to Rome. Rome is the religious and cultural dominant city of the world. It is where the Vatican is located, okay, where the religion of Roman Catholicism is centered. Rome itself was the heir to the spiritual knowledge of the Greek world, as well as the Egyptian world, and all the territories that the Romans conquered. They didn't just take the land, they didn't just take the resource wealth, but they took the knowledge, they took the books, and they brought them all to the central Roman library. The library at Alexandria, for example, one of the most comprehensive libraries in the world, a great wealth of information in the ancient world, was burned down, but not before the Romans stole the books and took them to their city. The collapse of the Roman Empire, the thing is, the Roman Empire didn't actually collapse. What it did was it got too big for its britches, and it started becoming unmanageable. It was just simply too big to be managed by one seat of power. So it started devolving into specific plots of land, which were all in truth still governed under the authority of the emperor in Rome, who became the Pope. What happened was that the Roman aristocratic imperial families moved up into Europe and became the royal dynasties of Europe, ruling under authority of Rome. The European saga played out throughout, the Dark Ages and the medieval times, and led eventually to the establishment of a second city, the city of London, okay, Babylon, okay, which was to be the economic center of the world. And of course, London is the capital city of England, of the United Kingdom, and from which an entire worldwide empire was established. So first there was a Roman Empire, conquered the known world over land and across the whole Mediterranean and the Near East. And then you had the second city established, London, the economic center, ruling under authority from Rome, from the emperor, the Pope. The right of the royal dynasties in Britain, as well as all over Europe, comes from the Pope. Now, through the second city, a worldwide naval empire was able to be created. Vast swaths of land were colonized, huge amounts of resources were taken, people were enslaved, lots of, really terrible stuff. One of the new lands, of course, that was colonized was the New World, the Americas. With the founding of the New World came an opportunity for the priests who run the empire to establish a third imperial city, a third crown from which to project their power upon the planet, and that became Washington, the District of Columbia, or, these days a better known, Washington, the District of Criminals. From these three cities, the empire is able to rule essentially the world. Rome with the religious and cultural standards of billions of people. London with the banking system, setting the prices of gold and silver, manipulating the prices of all assets over the world. So the economic center of power in the world is London. And you have Washington D.C., which has the power to control the physical life of every human being on the planet. If anybody gets out of line, Uncle Sam goes and drops a bomb on them, and that's that. Now, of course, there's plenty of other cities that are playing along in this imperial drama, and plenty of other countries that are affiliated with that Western Empire. There are plenty of other countries affiliated with the empire, but the point is that these three cities are the prime mechanism by which this ancient priestcraft can rule the world.